I posted the advertisement on a Tuesday in March, and I worded it the way I worded everything, plain, direct, and without a single unnecessary syllable. Horse rancher, 38, Copper Bend, seeks practical wife. Must be willing to work. No delicate constitutions. Reply to C. Breck, General Delivery. Nate Hollister at the post office read it back to me with his eyebrows halfway up his forehead and said, "Callum, you make it sound like you're hiring a mule." "I need someone useful," I told him. "A woman who can haul water and not faint at the sight of a barn. You might mention you've got all your teeth and a decent spread." "The spread speaks for itself. Post it." He posted it. I expected a reply from some stout widow in Kansas or a farm girl from Missouri, a woman who knew her way around a stove and wouldn't blink at manure on a boot sole. What I got, 6 weeks later, was a letter written in handwriting so precise it looked like it came off a printing press, on cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of lavender. "Dear Mr. Breck," it read, "I am writing in response to your advertisement. I am 27 years of age, in good health, educated, and entirely willing to work. I have no delicate constitution. I can arrive by the 14th of May if your offer stands. Respectfully, Miss Lenora Ashby, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Philadelphia. I read the letter twice, turned it over looking for some indication she was joking, and then set it on the table next to a horseshoe I'd been meaning to reshape. I should have written back and told her Copper Bend was not Philadelphia. I should have told her the nearest bookshop was 80 miles south and the nearest proper dress shop didn't exist. But 22 women had seen my advertisement, and exactly one had replied. So I wrote back, "Come ahead." The train pulled into Copper Bend on May 14th at 12:30, 40 minutes late on account of a mudslide near the pass. I was standing on the platform with my hat pulled low, wearing the cleanest shirt I owned, which still had a mended tear along the left cuff. Half the town had come to watch: Nate Hollister, Margaret Doan from the dry goods store, old Virgil Ketch who hadn't missed a public event since the Garfield assassination, and a handful of ranch hands from the Creole spread who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday. The door opened, and out stepped Lenora Ashby. She was not what I ordered. She was tall, nearly my height, with dark hair pinned up neatly under a hat that had never seen a speck of trail dust. She wore a dove-gray traveling dress with a fitted jacket, and her gloves were white, on a train that had crossed 1,000 miles of prairie. She carried a leather valise in one hand and held her skirt out of the mud with the other, and she looked at Copper Bend the way a surveyor looks at terrain, measuring it, not flinching from it. Behind her, a porter was wrestling a trunk the size of a steamer, chest down the steps. Margaret Doan leaned over to Nate and whispered something. I heard Nate cough to cover a laugh. One of the Creole hands elbowed the other. Lenora Ashby walked straight to me, because I was the only man on the platform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and said, "Mr. Breck." "That's me." She looked me over: the mended cuff, the sun-cracked face, the boots that had seen more mud than polish, and didn't react. She put out her hand. Her grip was firm, which I hadn't expected. "Miss Ashby," she said, "thank you for having me." I looked at her gloves, her pressed dress, her trunk that probably weighed more than my best saddle. I looked at the mud street behind me, the clapboard fronts, the hitching posts. I said what I was thinking, because I have never been any good at saying anything else. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand what you've signed up for." Something shifted behind her eyes, not hurt exactly, but a squaring of something. She said, "I read your advertisement quite carefully, Mr. Breck. You asked for willing and practical. I am both." "Can you saddle a horse?" "No." "Can you split firewood?" "I haven't, but I expect I can learn." "Can you cook for a working ranch?" A pause. "I can cook. Whether it meets your standard remains to be seen." Behind me I heard Nate Hollister say very quietly, "Lord have mercy." I stood there on that platform with the May sun on my neck and the smell of coal smoke in the air, and every practical bone in my body told me to hand this woman the return fare and apologize for wasting her time. She was a city woman. She had clean gloves. She had a trunk full of what I assumed were books and dresses that would be ruined inside a week. She had no business on a horse ranch in high country, and we both knew it. But she was looking at me with a steady gaze that didn't waver, and I have spent 20 years reading horses, and I know the difference between an animal that will bolt and one that will stand. She wasn't going to bolt. 30 days, I said before I'd fully decided to say it. Give it 30 days. If it doesn't suit, I'll pay your fare back myself. 30 days, she agreed. That's fair. I picked up her trunk. It was heavy books, as I'd guessed. I loaded it onto the wagon and helped her up to the seat, and she arranged her skirt without complaint and looked out at the road ahead with an expression I couldn't read. We rode the 4 miles to the ranch in near silence. I pointed out landmarks, the creel spread to the south, the creek where the road forked, the ridge where you could see weather coming 2 days early. She listened, nodded, asked no unnecessary questions. When we pulled into the yard, she looked at the ranch house, a solid 2-story frame building that I kept in good repair but had never bothered to make handsome. And at the barn, the corrals, the paddock where 3 2-year-olds were kicking up dust, and the office I'd built onto the back of the house that was really just a room full of paper and regret. It's a working ranch, I said, which was both obvious and defensive. I can see that, she said. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for my hand. Show me where I'll sleep and then show me where the kitchen is. I'd like to start. That was Lenora Ashby on her first hour in Copper Bend. I gave her the room upstairs, my wife's room, though I didn't say that and she didn't ask, and I showed her the kitchen, which was functional and not much else. She opened the cupboards one by one, examined the stove, checked the well pump and said, "I'll need a few things from the dry goods store. Make a list. I'll send it with Nate next time he comes through." "I'd prefer to go myself," she looked at me. "I'm better at selecting my own provisions." I took her to Margaret Doan's store the next morning. Margaret watched Lenora move through the shelves with the efficiency of a quartermaster and whispered to me at the counter, "Callum Breck, where on earth did you find this woman?" "She found me," I said, which was true. The first week was exactly as bad as I'd expected, in the ways I'd expected, and nothing like I'd expected in every other way. She burned the biscuits, not once, 3 times. The 4th batch was edible, and the 5th was good enough that I ate 4 of them without comment, which for me was high praise. She couldn't saddle a horse, but she watched my hand, Tamaz, do it once and then did it herself the second time, slowly and without grace but correctly. She couldn't split wood with any power, but she stacked what Tamaz split with a precision that made the woodpile look like a mason's wall. What she could do, what I hadn't thought to ask about, was think. On her 3rd day, she walked into my office, which I had told her was off limits in the way a man tells someone his mess is private, and stood in the doorway looking at the disaster of paper on my desk. Invoices stuffed in coffee cans, receipts folded into a ledger with no system, letters from buyers I'd never answered, and a feed bill from November that I'd been meaning to dispute. "Mr. Breck," she said, "I told you that room is mine. You're being overcharged for oats by roughly 18%. I looked up. "What?" "Your November feed invoice. I can see it from here. The price per bushel is 18% above the current rate published in the Territory Gazette. Either your supplier is dishonest or you haven't renegotiated in 2 years. I stared at her. She stared back. "May I?" she said, gesturing at the desk. "No." "Very well." She turned and left. I sat in that chair and looked at the November invoice, and I pulled out the Gazette Nate had delivered the week before, and I checked the rate, and she was right. She was exactly right. I didn't tell her that, not then. But the next morning when she came downstairs, I'd cleared a corner of the desk. I said, "You can look at the books. Don't move anything I'll need." She sat down at that corner, and within 2 hours she had the invoices sorted by date, the receipts matched to purchases, and a list of 7 discrepancies that had been costing me money for longer than I cared to admit. She didn't gloat. She didn't even mention it. She just set the list on my side of the desk and went to make supper. That was the thing about Lenora that I didn't understand at first, and that took me too long to appreciate. She didn't perform her competence. She just did things quietly and let the results stand. By the end of the second week, the ranch's books were in order for the first time since I'd inherited the place from my father. She'd written 3 letters to horse buyers whose names she'd found in my unanswered correspondence. Letters so well composed that 2 of them replied within the week, expressing interest in seeing my stock. She'd renegotiated the feed price with Asa Greer at the mill, not by arguing but by showing him the published rates and asking, very politely, if he'd made an error. Asa, who had been shortchanging ranchers for years and getting away with it because none of us could be bothered with paperwork, dropped his price without a word. Meanwhile, she still couldn't rope. She still rode like a woman who had learned riding from a book, which, as it turned out, she had. She still wore her hair pinned up neatly every morning, though the white gloves had been retired after the first day and replaced with a pair of Tamaz's old work gloves that swallowed her hands. Tamaz liked her. This surprised me. Tamaz was a quiet man from Sonora who had worked my ranch for 6 years and had opinions about everything but voiced almost none of them. On the morning of day 10, he said to me, while we were checking the fence line, "She is not what you expected." "No, she is better." I didn't answer. Tamaz went back to his wire. The trouble was that he was starting to be right, and I didn't know what to do with that. I had built this ranch into something solid through work and stubbornness, and I had done it alone since Clara died, 4 years now. 4 years of eating my own bad cooking and keeping my own worst books, and telling myself that a man didn't need more than a good horse and a clear fence line. Clara had been a rancher's daughter. She'd known how to do everything I needed. When she died of the fever in the winter of '81, I buried her on the hill behind the house, and I buried whatever part of me knew how to want things alongside her, and I got on with it. Lenora was nothing like Clara. She moved through the world differently, with a kind of upright composure that came from a life I couldn't imagine, a life of drawing rooms and proper schools and conversations about books I'd never heard of. She used words I had to think about. She held her teacup. I didn't even know I owned a teacup until she found it in a cupboard, with a steadiness that made the whole kitchen look rougher by comparison. And yet she got up before dawn every day. She hauled water without being asked. She learned the horses' names and temperaments within a week, and she talked to them in a low voice that made the skittish bay mare stand still for the first time in months. She ate whatever was put in front of her, including Tamaz's green chili, which had made grown men weep, and she said only, "That has some heat to it," and took another bite. On day 12, Harlan Creel rode over. Harlan ran the biggest spread south of the pass, 3,000 head of cattle, 12 hands, and an opinion of himself that outweighed all of it. He'd been widowed twice, married 3 times, and had a way of looking at other people's business as though it were a horse he was considering buying. He found Lenora in the yard, hanging laundry. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like she belonged in the landscape. Harlan looked her up and down from his saddle and said to me, "This the Maylorder bride, Breck." "She's here on a trial arrangement," I said. "Trial?" he grinned. "Well, she's easy enough to look at, I'll give you that. But what's she going to do when it's 40 below and the horses need breaking? Read them a poem." He laughed at his own joke. His hands laughed because they worked for him. Lenora stopped hanging the sheet. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, very still, with a clothespin in her hand, and I watched her shoulders settle into a line that I recognized from the train platform, that squaring, that refusal to flinch. "Harlan," I said, "I'm just saying, He leaned on his saddle horn. "You needed a working wife, Callum. You got yourself a parlor ornament." Something happened in my chest then that I didn't expect. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like the feeling I get when someone mistreats a horse, a tightening, a heat, a need to step between. "She's pulled her weight," I said, "which is more than your last foreman did before you ran him off." Harlan's grin died. He sat up in his saddle. "Now hold on. Go home, Harlan." He looked at me, then at Lenora, who had resumed hanging the laundry without turning around, and he rode off without another word. His hands followed in silence. That evening, Lenora set supper on the table, a stew that was, I had to admit, better than anything I'd made in 4 years, and sat down across from me and said, "You didn't need to do that." "Do what?" "Defend me to Mr. Creel." He was out of line. He was stating an opinion many people share, including, I suspect, you. I looked at my stew. She was right, of course. 3 weeks ago I'd have said the same thing Harlan said, just with less malice and fewer teeth. But 3 weeks ago I hadn't watched her talk a skittish horse into calmness, or find 18% theft in a feed bill, or eat Tomaz's chili without blinking. "I was wrong," I said. It was the first time I'd said those words to anyone in years, and they came out rougher than I intended, like a gate forced open after a long freeze. Lenora looked at me across the table, and something in her face softened, and she said, "The stew needs salt," and passed me the cellar, and we ate in a silence that was, for the first time, not uncomfortable. Day 15, halfway through the trial. I found her in the barn at midnight. The bay mare, the one I'd named Duchess because she was temperamental and proud, and refused to be handled by anyone she didn't respect, had gone off her feed that afternoon, and by evening she was sweating and shifting her weight and showing signs of colic that I'd seen kill horses twice her size. I'd planned to sit with Duchess through the night myself, but when I came out of the house with a lantern, Lenora was already there. She was kneeling in the stall in her nightgown with a shawl thrown over her shoulders, her hand on the mare's neck, talking in that low voice. She'd found the veterinary manual I kept on a shelf in the tack room. I'd bought it 2 years ago and read half of it before deciding I already knew everything I needed, and it was open on the ground beside her. "I read that colic can turn fatal within hours if the intestine twists," she said without looking up. "We need to keep her walking." "I know that." "Then help me get her up." We walked that horse for 4 hours, back and forth across the barn floor, through the yard and back, under a sky full of stars that neither of us looked at because we were watching Duchess. Lenora talked to her the whole time, quiet, steady nonsense about Philadelphia and the trains, and the way the light looked on the Schuylkill River in autumn. And the mare listened, the way horses listen when they trust a voice, with her ears turned and her breathing slowly easing. At 4 in the morning, Duchess passed the blockage. She dropped her head, blew out a long breath, and walked back into her stall on her own. Lenora sat down on a hay bale and put her face in her hands, and I couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying or both. I took my coat off and put it over her shoulders. She looked up at me, and in the lantern light her eyes were bright and exhausted, and she said, "She's going to be all right." "Because of you," I said. "Because we walked her." "You walked her, I just kept up." She pulled my coat tighter around herself and smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from her, not polite, not composed, but real, tired, and wide, and something shifted in my chest that I had been pretending wasn't shifting for 2 weeks. I went back to the house and I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and I thought about Clara, about the hill behind the house where she was buried, about the 4 years I'd spent telling myself that the ranch was enough and the work was enough, and a man didn't need anything soft or warm or alive sitting across the table from him. I thought about clean gloves on a muddy platform and a trunk full of books and a woman who burned the biscuits 3 times and then made them right. I thought about Harlan Creel saying "parlor ornament" and the heat in my chest when he said it. In the morning, Lenora came downstairs with her hair still loose. The first time I'd seen it down, and she checked on Duchess before she checked on the stove. And when she came back inside, she said, "That mare respects me now." "She's not the only one," I said. It came out before I could stop it, which is a thing that was beginning to happen with increasing frequency. And Lenora looked at me sharply, and I looked at my coffee, and we went about the day. The thing about the proving, about those middle weeks, is that it didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happened in coffee cans sorted and letters answered, and a horse saved, and a woman who woke up every morning and chose to stay in a place that wasn't built for her, and bent it gently toward something better without ever asking the place to apologize for what it was. She respected the ranch. That was what undid me, though I didn't name it then. She didn't try to make Copper Bend into Philadelphia. She didn't complain about the isolation or the mud or the lack of society or the fact that the nearest woman her age was Margaret Doane, who was 53 and more interested in discussing flower prices than literature. She took the ranch as it was rough, functional, honest, and she made it work better by bringing what she had. She didn't need to rope. She needed to think and organize and refuse to be beaten by a stove or a feed bill or a horse with a bellyache. On day 20, she rode Duchess. Nobody asked her to. Nobody suggested it. I came back from the north pasture in the late afternoon, and there she was in the paddock on the back of the horse that had thrown every hand I'd hired, riding in slow circles with her back straight and her hands quiet and the mare moving under her like water. Tamaz was leaning on the fence, watching. He looked at me and said nothing. He didn't need to. I stood there with my hat in my hands, and I watched Lenora Ashby ride my most difficult horse like she'd been doing it her whole life. And I understood, in the way you understand something you've known for a while but refused to say, that I was in trouble. Day 23, a man named Whitfield arrived. J.D. Whitfield was a horse buyer from St. Louis, one of the two men who had replied to Lenora's letters. He represented a consortium that supplied carriage horses to wealthy families back east, and he was looking for quality stock. He was also, as I discovered within 10 minutes of his arrival, the kind of man who used 30 words where 5 would do and expected the world to arrange itself around his schedule. He wanted documentation. Bloodlines, training records, veterinary histories, sale contracts with terms and guarantees. He wanted it in writing, notarized where possible, and he wanted it before he'd look at a single horse. I had none of it. I raised good horses, I knew that, and anyone who looked at my stock knew that, but I had never written down a bloodline in my life. I knew which mare had thrown which foal because I'd been there, not because I'd filed a certificate. My training records were in my head. My veterinary history was Tamaz, and I kept them alive. Whitfield sat in my kitchen, which Lenora had made presentable, and looked at me with the polished patience of a man accustomed to dealing with people he considered beneath him, and said, "Mr. Breck, I cannot present stock to my clients without proper provenance. Surely you understand." I understood. I also understood that this was the biggest potential sale I'd ever had. 12 horses at prices that would carry the ranch for 2 years, and I was about to lose it because I couldn't fill out a form. "Give me a day," I said. "I'm on the morning train the day after tomorrow," he said. "I'm afraid that's all the time I have." After he left for his room at the boarding house, I sat at the desk in my office and stared at the stacks of paper that Lenora had organized and felt the old familiar weight of being good at one thing and useless at everything else. Lenora appeared in the doorway. She'd been quiet through Whitfield's visit, watching, listening, saying nothing. "Tell me the bloodlines," she said. "What?" "You know them, you just haven't written them down. Tell me and I'll write them." I looked at her. She was already pulling a chair to the desk, already reaching for paper and the good pen she'd bought at Margaret's store, and she had that expression I'd come to recognize, the calm, focused look she wore when she was about to do something competent. We worked through the night. I talked and she wrote. I described every horse, who sired it, which mare carried it when it was foaled, how it was trained, what its temperament was, what it could do. She turned my rambling into clean, organized pages, a bloodline chart for each animal, a training history, a health record built from my memory and Tamaz's, and a set of sale terms written in language so professional that Whitfield wouldn't be able to find a flaw in them. At 2 in the morning, she looked up from the desk and said, "Your stock is exceptional. You should be charging more." I charge what's fair. You charge what's comfortable. Those aren't the same thing. I opened my mouth to argue and then closed it, because she was right, and because I was starting to understand that this happened fairly often. By dawn, she had a complete portfolio. 12 horses, documented, priced, and presented on clean paper with a cover letter that introduced the Breck Ranch and its stock with a quiet authority that I could never have managed. Whitfield came back that morning. Lenora met him at the door, handed him the portfolio and said, "Mr. Whitfield, I believe you'll find everything in order. Mr. Breck will show you the horses whenever you're ready." Whitfield looked at the portfolio. He looked at Lenora. He looked at me. Then he sat down and read every page, and I watched his expression change from polished impatience to genuine interest to something I can only describe as respect, reluctantly given. He spent 3 hours in the corrals and paddocks. He watched me work 3 of the horses and Tamaz work 2 more. He asked questions that I answered the way I always had, plainly, honestly, without embellishment, and Lenora stood beside him and supplemented every answer with the documentation to support it. At noon he bought all 12. Not at my price. At hers. She had set the price 15% above what I'd have asked, and Whitfield paid it without negotiation because the documentation was impeccable and the horses spoke for themselves. After Whitfield left, I stood in the empty corral and looked at the bank draft in my hand, more money than I'd ever held at once, and I turned to Lenora, who was standing at the fence with her arms folded and the wind pulling at her hair, and I said the second honest thing I'd said to her. "I couldn't have done that without you." "No," she agreed, "you couldn't." "That's not very gracious." "I'm not a very gracious woman, Mr. Breck. I'm a practical one. Isn't that what you advertised for?" I laughed. It surprised us both. I hadn't laughed a real laugh, not a grunt or a snort, in longer than I could remember, and the sound of it hung in the air between us like something fragile and unexpected. Lenora smiled. The real smile, the tired one, the one I'd seen in the barn at 4 in the morning with my coat on her shoulders. "Callum," she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. "Yes." "That mare is watching us." I turned. Duchess was standing at the paddock fence with her head over the rail, her ears forward, watching us with the expression of a horse who has formed an opinion and is waiting for the humans to catch up. "She's smarter than both of us," I said. "Most horses are," Lenora said, and went inside to make dinner. Day 27, 3 days left. I want to say I handled it well. I want to say I was smooth about it, or at least competent, the way a man ought to be when he's about to say something that matters. But I have never been smooth about anything in my life, and the closer the 30th day came, the more I felt like a man watching a train approach a washed-out bridge, seeing the disaster coming and having no idea how to stop it. The ranch was different. I could feel it in the walls. The kitchen smelled like bread most mornings now, and the office was clean, and there was a system for the invoices and a ledger that balanced and a stack of correspondence from buyers who wanted first look at next year's foals. Tamaz had started whistling, which he hadn't done in the 6 years I'd known him. Even the horses moved differently, calmer, steadier, as though they could feel the change in the air. And every evening, Lenora sat across from me at supper and we talked. Not about anything grand, about the horses, the weather, the price of wire fencing, a book she was reading that she tried to explain and I tried to follow. She told me about Philadelphia, about her father's shipping business, which had been prosperous and then wasn't, ruined by a partner's dishonesty and a series of debts that swallowed everything. About standing in the parlor of the house she'd grown up in and watching strangers carry out the furniture. About the morning she read my advertisement in a gazette someone had left on a boarding house table, and deciding that practical and willing was a thing she could be. "I didn't come here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I want you to understand that. I had options. A cousin in Baltimore offered me a room. A school in Connecticut was willing to hire me as a teacher. I chose this." "Why?" She looked at the stove, then at the window, then at me. "Because your advertisement was honest," she said. "You didn't pretend to be anything you weren't. You said you needed help and you meant it. Do you know how rare that is?" I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which is my usual response to things that matter. And she let the silence stand because she had learned by then that my silences were not refusals. Day 29. I climbed the hill behind the house. I hadn't been up there since autumn. Clara's grave was a simple stone, her name, the years, nothing else, because she'd been a simple woman who'd have hated a fuss. The wildflowers were coming up around it, the way they did every spring, and I stood there with my hat off and I talked to her. I don't know what I said. I don't know if I said anything out loud or just thought it. But I stood there for a long time, and what I felt wasn't guilt exactly. It was something more like permission. Like the land itself was telling me that a grave is a place for the dead, and the house below was a place for the living, and a man could honor both without betraying either. I came back down the hill, and Lenora was on the porch. She was sitting in the chair I never used. I'd built that porch and put 2 chairs on it because Clara had asked me to. And after she died I couldn't sit there, so I didn't, and she was reading with a cup of tea beside her, and she looked up when she heard my boots on the step. She saw where I'd been. She didn't ask about it. "I made tea," she said. "There's a cup for you if you want it." I sat down in the other chair, the one I hadn't sat in for 4 years. The tea was strong and good, and I drank it looking out at the valley and the mountains and the light coming sideways through the cottonwoods, and Lenora read her book beside me, and neither of us said anything, and it was the most peaceful I'd been since the winter of '81. Day 30. I was up before dawn. I fed the horses, checked the fences, did every chore I could think of to put off what I knew I had to do. By the time I came inside, Lenora had breakfast on the table, eggs, biscuits that were now better than any I'd ever eaten, and coffee strong enough to straighten wire. She sat down across from me and folded her hands and said, 30 days. 30 days. I believe the terms of our arrangement require a decision. They do. She looked at me steadily. I'd like to hear it. I set down my fork. I looked at my hands, scarred, calloused, the hands of a man who'd spent his life gripping reins and hammers and fence wire and not much else. I looked at the kitchen, which was cleaner than it had been in years. I looked at the doorway to the office, where the books balanced and the letters were answered, and the future of the ranch was organized on clean paper in precise handwriting. I looked at Lenora. I posted that advertisement because I needed a wife who could work a ranch, I said. I needed someone who could rope and ride and haul water and not faint at the sight of a barn. That's what I thought I needed. And I was wrong. The words came hard, the way they always did, like pulling nails, but I kept going because I owed her the rest of it. I didn't need a woman who could rope. I needed a woman who could think, who could see what I couldn't see and fix what I didn't know was broken, who could walk a horse through a colic night and talk a feed supplier into honesty and ride the one mare on this place that wouldn't let anyone else near her. I stopped. I was not a man of speeches. That was more words in a row than I'd spoken since Clara's funeral, and I was already running out of air. I was wrong about what I needed, I said, and I'm asking you to stay, not for a trial, not as an arrangement, as my wife, if you'll have me. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Lenora sat very still across the table, and I could see something working behind her eyes, not doubt, not hesitation, but something careful and thorough, the way she considered everything, from a feed bill to a future. Then she said, "Callum." "Yes." "I made my decision on day 12. I blinked. "What?" "The night you defended me to Mr. Creel. You told him I'd pulled my weight, and then you told him to go home, and you meant both. That was the night I decided." "You've known for 18 days. I'm a practical woman, Mr. Breck. I don't require 30 days to recognize a good investment." I stared at her. She was smiling, the real smile, the wide one, and there was color in her cheeks that I didn't think had anything to do with the stove. "Then why didn't you say something?" I asked. "Because you needed the 30 days, she said, "not me." She was right. She was always right. It was the most infuriating and the finest thing about her. I stood up from the table and I crossed the kitchen, and I took her hand, the hand that had arrived in a white glove and was now rough from pump water and rains and hay. And I held it the way you hold something you've just realized you cannot afford to let go. "I'm not a gentle man," I said. "I don't know how to say pretty things. I'll likely be difficult about half of everything you suggest, and I'll be wrong about most of it, and I'll never remember to wipe my boots." "I know all of that," she said. "I've lived with you for 30 days. And you're staying anyway." "I'm staying because of it, not anyway." She squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm, the way it had been on the platform. "I didn't come west looking for a gentle man, Callum. I came looking for an honest one. I found him." I kissed her. It was not graceful and it was not smooth, and my coffee was getting cold on the table, but it was real, and it was the first real thing I had done since the winter of '81, and it felt like a door opening in a house I'd boarded up and forgotten had windows. Tamaz, who had impeccable timing and no respect for privacy, chose that moment to appear in the kitchen doorway with a broken halter in his hands. He looked at us, looked at the halter, set the halter on the counter, and walked back out. From the porch I heard him say, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Finally." We were married on a Saturday in June, in the yard of the ranch, by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, and who charged $2 and a meal. Margaret Doane stood up for Lenora. Tamaz stood up for me. Nate Hollister attended in his capacity as postmaster and chief gossip. Old Virgil Ketch sat in a chair we brought out for him and said, when it was over, "About damn time someone put curtains in that kitchen." Harlan Creel was not invited. He heard about it anyway, because Copper Bend was the kind of town where you couldn't sneeze without 4 people asking if you needed a handkerchief. And when I saw him at the feed store the following week, he looked at me and said, "I hear your parlor ornament sold 12 horses. 15% above asking," I said. He didn't have a reply for that. The ranch changed, and I changed with it, and the changing was not the painful tearing I'd expected, but a slow, steady opening, like a creek thawing in spring. The ice doesn't break all at once but gives way inch by inch until one morning the water is running clean, and you can't remember what the silence sounded like. Lenora put curtains in the kitchen. She ordered a bookshelf from a carpenter in the valley and filled it with volumes I'd never have chosen, poetry and history, and a 3-volume set on animal husbandry that I pretended I wasn't reading, and that she pretended not to notice I was reading. She kept the books balanced and the correspondence current and the feed bills honest. And when the next foaling season came, she was in the barn beside me at 2 in the morning with her sleeves rolled up and her hands steady, helping a mare through a difficult birth with a calm that made me wonder how I'd ever managed without her. She sat on the porch with me in the evenings, both chairs filled. She read, I watched the valley. Sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and both were fine. She rode Duchess every morning. The trail to Clara's grave stayed clear. Lenora never asked me to stop going up there, and I never felt the need to pretend I didn't. She understood, without my having to explain, which was a mercy because I couldn't have, that a man can carry a grief and a gratitude for the same woman, and that making room for the living doesn't mean evicting the dead. She put wildflowers on the stone once, without telling me, and I found them there on a morning walk and stood for a long time looking at them, and what I felt was not sorrow but something close to grace. It's been 3 years now. The ranch is the best it's ever been, 30 horses in the string, buyers riding from as far as Chicago, a barn that Tamaz and I rebuilt last autumn with lumber Lenora negotiated at a price that made the sawmill owner shake his head in defeat. The books balance. The bills are paid. The porch has 2 chairs and both of them are used. I think about that advertisement sometimes. Horse rancher, 38, seeks practical wife, must be willing to work, no delicate constitutions. I got exactly what I asked for. I just didn't know what I was asking. She arrived in clean gloves on a May afternoon, a city woman with a trunk of books and a gaze that didn't waver, and she walked into a life that wasn't built for her and made it better by being exactly who she was. Not what I thought I needed, but what I actually needed, which is a different thing entirely and the more important one. I was a man who knew horses and fences and hard work and not much else, and she was a woman who knew everything I didn't. And between us, we built a life that neither of us could have built alone. That's not the shape I thought this story would take when I posted that advertisement on a Tuesday in March, but it's the shape it took, and I wouldn't change a word of it. Not even the burned biscuits. Especially not those.